kind of outcomes will there be for people with disabilities is often determined by culture and society. Disabilities have always existed and cruel treatment still exists. Sometimes it's informal, like bullying that goes on in schools, and sometimes it is more planned. For example, deciding not to hire someone with a disability. In the early 1900s, Goddard's research implied that low intelligence and deviant behavior were hereditary, which resulted in discrimination. Forced sterilization was a popular solution at that time. In fact, it was approved by the Supreme Court in 1927, but overturned in 1942. The deficit perspective on disabilities reflects the idea that human behavior and characteristics shared by people are distributed along a continuum. Test scores received by people tend to create a distribution where the majority of people fall in the middle of the distribution, and that's why they are called average. Think of the bell curve. This way of describing human beings puts, as your textbook says, about half of everyone below average. It also forces us to examine how individuals are different from one another and how they are different from the average. Culture influences how a person reacts to a disability, and not all cultures perceive disabilities in the same way. What is considered to be a disability in one culture may not be seen as a disability in another. For example, members of the deaf community may not see hearing loss as a disability. Many people who are deaf see themselves as having their own culture complete with their own language. The sociological perspective on disabilities views how a society treats individuals and not a condition or set of traits as what makes people different from one another. Some scholars caution against this view of disability and the idea that if we just treated people with significant differences like everyone else, then the problems they have as a result of their disability would disappear. That may lead to conclusions that individuals with disabilities do not need special services, and create an attitude that needed services can be discontinued. Disabilities are significant to the individual who has them, regardless of how society treats them. People with disabilities are at times seen as a minority group because they too are at times treated negatively or are discriminated against because of their disability. People with disabilities have always been a part of our society, but as a part of society, their needs were largely ignored in past times. Why was this? It was probably due to a lack of knowledge regarding people with differences of any kind. As you are probably well aware, it has been our society's nature to segregate and discriminate against those groups of people who look, act, or think differently than the majority. No exception was made with people who had disabilities. In fact, publicly supported programs of education very often excluded persons with disabilities. And until the 1970s, there were actually state laws that allowed public schools to deny enrollment to children with disabilities. The link in this slide will take you to a book called Christmas in Purgatory. It is a photo essay of life in an institution for people with disabilities. Consider the case of Beatty versus the Board of Education from 1919. In this case, a student had a disability that caused him to drool, have involuntary facial contortions, and have speech problems. Although his disability was strictly physical and his intellectual ability was not affected, he was expelled from school because this condition nauseated the teachers and other students. This case went before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and the court ruled that school officials could indeed exclude students with disabilities. Once this student was removed from a public education setting, it was actually suggested that he attend a school for students who were deaf. Hardly an appropriate placement. Just imagine for a moment if this case were to take place today. Fortunately, the outcome would be different. First seen in 1797, the boy was seen in the woods near Lucerne, France. In 1798, the boy was trapped and held by a woman in the same area where he later escaped. In 1800, the boy sought shelter in a home where the boy was held, this time until they could hold him in a hospital in Rhodes, France. 4.5 feet tall, the boy walked with an uneven gait, much as runners use to improve their speed. There was no sign that he had ever walked on all fours, the knees His knees were ordinarily uncalloused. Most often he would just sit and rock himself from side to side or backwards and forwards, his head held up and his eyes fixed ahead of him. His primary interests were in food. On being given a mirror, the boy could make nothing of it, looking once behind it to try to find the child that he had seen within its surface. That's a quote from a book by Newton in 2004. After many examinations by doctors, it was determined that the boy was not a wild boy, but a boy who was just an idiot. His functions were that primarily of an animal. He was able to stay in an apartment in the institution where he was cared for by Madame Guerin, who the boy, who is now called Victor by Itard, grew fond of as if she was a mother figure. Victor never developed language and died at the age of 40 in 1828. Edward Seguin was Itard's student, and he expanded on the methods Itard used to work with Victor. Maria Montessori was Edward Seguin's student. How many of you are familiar with the Montessori schools? The Montessori method of teaching is a student-centered approach that is structured around a child's innate desire to learn. Teachers using a Montessori mode of instruction work to provide students with a stimulating environment and tools needed to explore and learn about the environment. Teachers set minimal limits and design a curriculum based on a child's level of development. Gallaudet was a pioneer in deaf education. In 1817, he opened the Hartford School for the Deaf in Connecticut, but it is now known as the American School for the Deaf. Howe was founder and director of the New England Asylum for the Blind. The institution, through him, became one of the intellectual centers of American philanthropy, and by degrees obtained more and more financial support. In 1837, Howe brought Laura Bridgman to the school, a young deaf-blind girl who later became a teacher at the school. She became famous as the first known deaf-blind person to be successfully educated. Helen Keller came later. She was not born until 1880, and she is the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Unfortunately, opportunities from the two world wars provided more opportunities to learn about people with disabilities, head injuries, physical injuries, as well as psychological impact war had on the soldiers. Other wars also had an impact on how people with disabilities were treated by society. People realized that we needed to provide assistance and support to the soldiers who were coming home from the various wars. Civil rights and Brown versus the Board of Education. One comment made during this case was that if we let the black kids into school, the disabled kids would want in also. Keep in mind that in 1962, only 16 states had laws that included students with mild mental retardation under mandatory school attendance. Brown versus the Board of Education did exactly what those people feared it would do. It let the black kids in, and then the disabled kids wanted in also. Brown versus the Board of Education is a civil rights case that says separate is not equal. In Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the state barred the retarded from schools. One thing to keep in mind with that case is the fact that over time the definition of mental retardation has changed, and that many of the kids classified as mentally retarded then would be considered learning disabled today. Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia did not outright exclude students with disabilities, but waitlisted approximately 1,000 kids because it would cost too much to let them in all at one time and educate them. Park and Mills established three principles. The Constitution guarantees of equal protection and due process, prevents schools from excluding students solely on their basis of disabilities. Parents must have a range of opportunities, such as impartial hearings and access to the courts, to challenge the school's decisions regarding their children's educational programs. And 3, exorbitant costs are no excuse for failure to grant the disabled access to the public education system. After Park and Mills, in the next 2 years, 27 states had litigation resulting in similar decisions. Many enacted laws mandating education for people with disabilities. This is the legislation that impacts schools now. The EHA is the first freestanding statute for people with disabilities. Amendments in 1974 added federal grants for states to help educate handicapped and required states to detail their plans for achieving the goal of educating disabled children. 504 of the ADA is a broad anti-discrimination statute that applies to any institution that receives federal funds. It says specifically, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall solely by reason of his disability be excluded from participation in, or be denied benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance under the Office of Civil Rights. IDEA expanded the Education for All Handicapped Children Act into a multi-billion-dollar program of grants to help states uphold the 14th Amendment responsibility of equal protection. The U.S. Department of Education stated in its regulations that special education means specially designed instruction at no cost to the parent to meet the unique need of a child with a disability, including instruction conducted in the classroom, in the home, in hospitals and institutions, and in other settings, and instruction in physical education. Special education is provided to individuals with disabilities from birth through age 21. It meets the unique learning needs of infants, preschoolers, and students with disabilities. It is delivered in different settings. It reflects a variety of instructional targets and differs from the general education approach. So what does that mean, that it differs from the general education approach? Well, special education targets different learning, behavioral, social, communication, and functional needs. The key difference is on the individualized nature of the instruction. What is best for one student rather than what is the best way to teach a group of students, or the best way to teach another student. One thing to keep in mind with this definition is that some kids may differ from the norm, but not need special education. They may be gifted students or have a disability, but that disability does not negatively impact their education, and therefore they don't require special education. Impairment is the loss or reduction in function of a body part or organ. For example, Devin, who had a diving accident and is paralyzed below his waist, has an impairment. Disability versus a handicap. A disability exists when an impairment, a loss or reduction in a function of the body, limits the ability to perform certain tasks. A handicap is a problem encountered when interacting with the environment. For example, Devin has a disability due to a lack of mobility caused by his paralysis. Devin would also have a handicap if he wanted to enter a building that has stairs but no ramp for his wheelchair. What you need to understand from this is the fact that a person with a disability does not have to have a handicap. How many exceptional children are there? 3,641,000. Actually, it's impossible to state the precise number because different criteria are used from state to state. For example, a student who is considered to have mental retardation in one state may not be identified as having mental retardation in another. Special education categories for classifying disabilities include 13 categories. They're on this slide. Where are students with special needs educated? Well, as you can see, they are no longer frequently placed in residential facilities. In fact, most, 75%, spend at least part of their day in a general education classroom, and this number is growing. Georgia has the goal of 90% of students with disabilities spending at least 80% of the day in a general education classroom. Access to the general curriculum is mandated by IDEA and NCLB. And here is why. Only 54% of students with disabilities leave school with a standard high school diploma. Students instructed in general education classrooms are more likely to receive a standard diploma. IDEA requires all students with disabilities to have access to the general education curriculum. Placement needs to be addressed in the IEP, and alternative curricular options are still needed. Labels are required to receive the funding from IDEA that is necessary to provide the special education programs that students with disabilities need. Labels can be used to group students with similar characteristics so that goals and expectations can be determined and worked on. Some people feel that the use of disability labels is inappropriate and can result in negative consequences, such as lower expectations by the student and the teacher, peer rejection, and poor self-concept. Concerns with labeling include inaccurate labels because of problems in validity, assessing children from diverse cultural or linguistic backgrounds. It is also important to remember that a label rarely provides specific information about a student's educational needs. Why are laws governing the education of exceptional children necessary? Remember, special education has an exclusionary past. It has only been in recent years, the past almost 40 years, that children with disabilities have been guaranteed a free, appropriate public education. Do you know that FAPE or FAPE means free, appropriate public education, which means at no additional cost to parents? Appropriate must be individually determined. LRE is not automatically delivered in a certain place. It does not equal general education placement and offers a continuum of alternative placements. IEP is an individualized educational program and is written for children ages 3 to 21. IFSPs are for children from birth through age 2. These documents are the legal cornerstone to appropriate education, entitle each individual to a uniquely designed program, and support services. Shared decision-making or family involvement includes roles of the parents in the IEP process and are very important. Parent advocacy groups can also support families and work with families. Each of these items were as a result of a court case against a school system. For example, California had a number of court cases about Hispanic and Chinese students who were learning to speak English and were classified as mentally retarded based on IQ tests that were administered in English. These types of court cases led to the inclusion of non-discriminatory identification and evaluation requirement of IDEA. This is what IDEA covers. Children who are gifted and talented are not covered by IDEA. It is optional for states to provide programs for these students, although the Gifted and Talented Children's Education Act of 1978 does provide financial incentives for states to develop such programs. Special education as an intervention looks at working with students who are at risk before they are labeled as special ed. Special education as instruction is individually planned, specialized, and intensive instruction designed to help students meet their individual educational goals. Who are providers of special education? Many people, as you can see from this slide, but two important people are missing who are mandated to be a part of the special education process: the parents and the general education teacher. Language and sensitivity. Think about something you don't like about yourself. Maybe you think you have a big nose, or you don't like the fact that you are short. How would you like it if people referred to you by that trait? For example, Short Steve, or Big Nose Betty. I'm betting that you wouldn't like that very much. How do you think a kid feels when they are referred to as the MR kid, or the LD kid? There are some of the arguments for and against full inclusion. Full inclusion meaning that all students are included in the general education class all of the time, regardless of any disability they might have. Many people believe in full inclusion. Others believe in the continuum of placement options and the least restrictive environment, and the idea that the environment will not look the same for all students. For example, the least restrictive environment for a student who is deaf-blind might not look the same as the least restrictive environment for a student who has mental retardation, mild mental retardation. Okay, let's check. Do you know what these stand for? What's FAPE? If you said free appropriate public education, you're right. LRE? least restrictive environment. How about an IEP? Yep, individualized educational program for children's ages 3 to 21. TBI? Haven't covered that one yet, but that's traumatic brain injury. LD? Learning disability. And MR is mental retardation and is sometimes referred to as an intellectual disability. Oops, and I forgot to click the slide. I guess you couldn't know what these stood for because I didn't do it on the right slide. So let's do them again. FAPE, free appropriate public education. LRE, least restrictive environment. IEP, individualized educational program. TBI, traumatic brain injury. LD, learning disability. MR, mental retardation. Sorry about that. Related services are those activities or supports that enable a child with a disability to receive a free, appropriate public education. These related services might include transportation, speech-language pathology, and audiology services, interpreting services, psychological services, social work services, physical therapy, occupational therapy, orientation and mobility services, or school health services.